Hi, my name is Clint Hayes. I am the author and creator of Zeamer, In just a couple of days now, we are going to finally get to see Masters of the Air. It's going to be hitting our TV screens after a very long delay. Anyone visiting this channel almost certainly knows what that is, but for those who don't, it is the latest miniseries brought to us by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks that has sought to portray the experiences of American servicemen in different theaters of World War II. Band of Brothers, of course, was the first one, and it portrayed the experiences of the Army in Europe. It was followed by The Pacific, which followed the Marines in the Pacific. And now they're taking us back to Europe. And this time they're going to be showing us the experiences of those who served in the air war over Europe in the later parts of the war, mostly focusing on the 8th Air Force. I'm very much looking forward to the series. I have been for years. I've been following it, as many other people have, since it was at HBO and then went into hibernation for a very long time before Apple picked it up as one of their first premiere projects. So I'm looking forward to it, but because of my background with this crew, the most highly decorated aircrew in American history, and the war that they served in, the part of the war they served in, which was the Southwest Pacific Theater in 1942 and the first half of 43, it's hard for me not to compare what we're going to be seeing in Masters of the Air with what everyone in the 5th Air Force and beyond experienced in the Southwest Pacific in that earlier part of the war. The differences between the two theaters are literally and figuratively the polar opposite. They're staggeringly different. So I thought it would be kind of cool to show those differences. We know what we've come to expect of the European Air War. We've seen it in numerous movies and TV shows and countless documentaries over the years, and now we're going to see it again in Masters of the Air. And that doesn't take anything away from those by any means, and certainly not from Masters of the Air. But there has been a hugely disproportionate view of the European theater versus the Southwest Pacific Theater. The European theater has been well covered, and the Southwest Pacific Theater has never been covered. Not really. We saw flashes of it in like Baba Black Sheep, the TV show back in the 70s that followed Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron. But barely. And certainly the Bomber War has never been covered. It's only beginning to get covered a little bit in print. So people simply don't know what occurred down there and what that was like. So, to that end, I thought I'd make a video comparing the two. So to really be able to appreciate and understand the difference between the two theaters, I'm going to start with England first. Now, most of this is going to be very familiar to anybody who's seen 12 O'Clock High, either the movie or the TV show, Memphis Belle, Battle of Britain, so many movies about the European theater and based there, and all the documentaries we've seen, and what we're going to be seeing in Masters of the Air. We're going to see these modern, for the era, air bases that were spread over, dozens of acres of the English countryside with these modern buildings, certainly all the modern aircraft, and Europe first. So Europe was getting it got first choice on all the aircraft. We're used to seeing, we're going to definitely see this in Masters of the Air. You've got your operations building here. This doubles as operations in the tower. You've got the modern hangar in the background. Inside, this is the heartbeat of operations. Most of the facilities use these Nissen huts. They use them for the general facilities, for barracks, but these Nissen buildings were everywhere in England. And again, they used them for barracks like this. I love this shot with all the bicycles out here. And these weren't the comfort of home in the United States, but still, you've got this enclosed structure with aluminum. You've got the stoves inside like this. You can see the stove here. All the bunks for all the guys. You can see the aluminum siding there. When you're getting food, when you're heading for the mess hall, this is a pretty common scene. Everybody lined up with their mess kits. And again, with the Nissen building, everybody files in to get served and eat in there. Unless you're an officer. If you're an officer, it can look more like this. And Officers' Mess, Park Lane, London, England. You can see it right there. And this wasn't everywhere, I'll grant that. But still, this is what the officers got to partake of sometimes. This is one of the hospitals in England. They weren't all like this. Some of them look like this. And again, this isn't where the staff lived. The staff, in fact, this one, Linland Park, I believe this is. But the barracks are over here off to the side. And again, it's all those Nissen huts. But the hospital itself was this. For recreation, you had everything that England and civilization had to offer. You were based near these towns, and you could either take one of those bikes into town, or get a ride, or sometimes they would have organized events where everybody would get piled into the trucks here, and they would take them in for whatever recreation. In this case, I believe it said it was for a dance like that. Obviously, plenty of women around. And it was all the pleasures that you would expect of 1940s civilization in Britain. You had your clubs, you had your sports, you had your pubs. Just everything that you would expect to find in a British town was there when you had a pass to leave. When it came to the crews, this is what we're used to seeing. The cool bomber jackets, the officers, were definitely officers. They had their hats. And, this is what you expected. You had your cold weather gear ready. And when you were on a mission, this is what it looked like. You were always at high altitude, so you always had your oxygen on. You always had your cold weather gear on. If your oxygen got separated, you had maybe 30 seconds or so before you passed out. It happened on a regular occurrence. And when it came to the aircraft, obviously these air bases had scores, if not hundreds, of aircraft. And when it came to launch a mission, this is what it looked like. It was a highly coordinated, highly choreographed, precise dance to get all these planes into the air. And when they would get into the air, this is what they'd see. This is what you'd see if you're looking out your window. You would see those dozens or scores of aircraft out there. And they were most definitely bombing from very high altitude. Which brings us to the South Pacific. And I wanted to start with this map. And this map cracks me up because obviously it's made for third graders. But it actually does a really good job of illustrating the geographical difference between these two areas. If you look, here's Europe. Here's England, and here's the part of Europe that's the problem. And if you look at this, it's actually closer to the Arctic Circle than it is even to the Tropic of Cancer, much less the equator and the true tropics. When you start looking down here at the Pacific theater, you've got a much different story. Now, the Pacific was divided into several military designations. You had the North Pacific, you had Central Pacific, you had South Pacific, which stretched down just to the east of the major islands of the Pacific and coming down through the Lower Solomons here, as I recall. The Southwest Pacific Theater comprised most of Burma and over here through most of Southeast Asia through Burma, down through the the Dutch East Indies, I guess Netherlands East Indies now, Java, the Philippines, all of Papua New Guinea, and northern Australia, and over here into the Solomons, including the Solomon Sea. This is all, I mean, if you look at this, this is just below the equator. This is true jungle. New Guinea was true jungle. Northern Australia was true jungle. It was hot and it was wet. And that was not good for engine parts, especially when you get down into Australia where it is the opposite. It is dry and it is dusty, which takes us to the next map. This is the main area of action when you're talking about 1942 and at least the first half of 1943 and the Southwest Pacific Theater. When we're talking about the story of the eager beavers, this was where they lived and worked. Now, when you're talking about the difference between the two areas, between Jungle New Guinea, which is Port Moresby and Milne Bay, and the prairies of Australia, we're talking about Townsville. Woodstock was a small airstrip with Charters Towers. I don't even have on here Torren Creek. These were all in red, dusty plains. So when you are talking about leaving your base down here in Australia to fly up to Port Moresby, you're talking about leaving this area of fine particulate dust, which clogs engines and works its way into every piece of equipment you can think of. And then you fly up to Port Moresby, which Jim Murphy, who was a pilot for the 63rd Bomb Squadron, in his book Skip Bombing, described it as walking into a shower with your clothes on. So it's really a 1-2 punch when it comes to aircraft parts, especially engines, which were in need of constant repair. And of course, that was made that much harder by being at the very drip end of a 6,000 mile supply chain. And of course, they're officially second in line to Europe for aircraft and parts. Which takes us to this map. Why were they having to be based in Australia and only use Port Moresby as a departure point? Well, it's because of this. This is the Japanese Empire in 1942 up through about August of 42. Of course, at the time of Pearl Harbor, Japan had already taken most of this area here. And as the year progressed, they very quickly swept down through Southeast Asia, through the Philippines, through the East Indies and Java and all of this, steadily working their way down into New Guinea. In May and June of 1942, they got down through the Solomon Islands. And by August, this is what they had. They'd taken all the Marianas, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, all of this. And, getting out into the Central Pacific Theater towards Midway. So this is what Japan owned, and truly owned, in terms of air supremacy. Port Moresby, again, is right here on the east coast, the southeastern coast of New Guinea. And it's the only place the Allies could use as a forward base. They simply couldn't stay there because it was being bombed every day and every night by the Japanese. So it was a case where they would take off in the afternoon, late afternoon, from any of the Australian bases. Marba was a major one. Townsville and Woodstock are about a 3.5-hour flight at that point, if you're cruising at 180 miles an hour. And a B-17 headed up to Port Moresby. Marba was a little bit shorter. When they finally got up into Iron Range, they cut that down to about an hour to an hour and a half. Depending on, of course, what the weather is. Again, this is tropical. You are dealing with some of the most violent thunderstorms on Earth in this area. Hank Dominski, Zeamer's co-pilot, describes their mission of January 17th, where they actually won air medals for Sarnowski getting his first ship that night, an 8,000-ton merchant ship in Rabaul Harbor. They got bounced around like they were a paper airplane. Dubinski describes it very vividly in one of his diary entries. So that's yet another climatic issue that they're having to deal with, one of the obstacles that they're having to deal with here. So what did it look like? Well, if we're talking about their bases in Australia, we're going to start with the first one. The first photo is of Torren Creek right here. This is Torren Creek. You've got this little village down here. It's got squat. There is nothing there. You've got a railroad passing through. You've got some little stockyards. I believe you had maybe a hotel or two, if that, which is kind of funny if you think about it. You've got the airstrip cut out of the eucalyptus woods here with the various taxiways and revetments. This is where the planes were stored, and the squadron's tents would just be scattered through the trees here as they were available. This is at Marba, and they didn't have to worry about being bombed by the Japanese here, so they would just leave the aircraft lined up along the runway a lot of the time when they knew they were going to be going. I believe they had some revetments off in the trees here, but a lot of the time they just park them alongside this very arid runway. This is up in New Guinea. This is Milne Bay. They're on the eastern tip of New Guinea, cut out of the jungle. And again, this was very hot, humid. Whenever they would have monsoon seasons, it turned the entire area into just pure muck. This is Iron Range. This is that base at the far north end of Queensland, far northern tip. And again, you can see they've literally just cut this out as quickly as possible in a matter of weeks to make it available as a forward base. The 403rd Squadron that Zeamer and Sarnowski were both in was based here for a short while. Zeamer had been here as part of the 22nd Bomb Group, the B-26 group that he was in prior to the 403rd as well. And again, just cut right out of the jungle. And you can see they didn't do a lot of cleanup sometimes. It was all very fast and furious just to get the airstrip made. This is also in Iron Range. I believe this is one of the 33rd Bomb Groups, 33rd Bomb Squadron of the 22nd Bomb Group, B-26, and one of the revetments there at Iron Range. And then you get to Port Moresby. When I say that life in the Southwest Pacific Theater, especially in New Guinea in early mid-42, was a mashup of Gilligan's Island and MacGyver, this is what I'm talking about. This was the first control tower at Port Moresby, that 7-mile strip. There were a series of strips that were constructed there at east of Port Moresby that were designated, but they had actual names. 7-mile strip was also called Jackson Aerodrome, I believe by the Australians and the RAF. But the Americans tended to refer to them by how far they were from Port Moresby. So you had 5-mile strip, 7-mile strip, 14-mile strip, that sort of a thing. But this is the control tower at 7-mile strip, and I believe this is July of 42. And it stayed this way for a little while. After a while, they made it a little bit fancier. They used actual wood construction with a grass hut that was straight out of Gilligan's Island at the base. When there would be an air raid, a gentleman at the top of the tower would fire off a pistol, I believe 3 times, to alert everyone in camp that there was an incoming raid. Here you have some of the revetments that did come later at 7-mile strip. This is spring of 43. This is a little more advanced than what they had at first, but still, it's just wide open. And, they would build these earthen embankments for the revetments to try to protect the aircraft from nearby blasts. But still, you can see the woods here and, all around. This is one of the hospitals. I believe this is the 10th evacuation hospital there in Port Moresby. And as you can see, it's just tents. And in fact, instead of Nissen huts, this is what life was lived in the Southwest Pacific by everybody. This was a picture that was sent to me by the son of Bud Thews, who was Jay Zeamer's flight engineer. This was their camp area. And these were 4 men pyramidal tents, And when it would rain, it would obviously come right into the tent. Some of the guys would be able to build them up onto wooden platforms to at least keep the water out. But when it got real bad, it would slosh over. Sometimes tents just got swept away because this was during monsoon season. And again, it would just turn the area into ankle and sometimes knee-deep mud. In the prairies of Australia, you had to battle flies. There were just hordes and hordes of flies. There were still flies in New Guinea, plenty. They talked about the one-armed salute, where when they would eat, they would keep wiping the flies and mosquitoes away, between bites. In New Guinea, it was all about the mosquitoes. They were just fierce. At one point or another, they had almost 30% of the 403rd Squadron overall had been taken out by either dengue fever or malaria. At any one time, they might be missing 10% of their personnel, either sick in quarters or sick in the hospital. More tents. This is at Iron Range, and you can tell it looks like a Civil War encampment. And I believe this is the 22nd Bomb Group. They would set up these tents, and this is where life was lived. They would play cards, play baseball, sometimes play football, listen to the radio. There really wasn't much to do. They would sometimes go days, even a week or two, without missions. It just depended on what was going on in the war at the time, what was going on with their planes, in terms of parts and maintenance. This was life, and there was no place to go. You couldn't, when you were at Woodstock, sometimes you could catch a train into Townsville, which was a decent-sized little town, about 20,000 people. But if you were at Torren Creek or Iron Range, you were just stuck there, and there was no civilization to be had. Some of them had some open air, they could do open air films and some stuff like that, but there really wasn't much to do at all. This is the operations tent at Iron Range, I believe, for one of the 22nd Bomb Group squadrons. And you can see they've just got ropes lashing it to the trees to help it stand up. Here we have a briefing at operations, and you can see the dress is a little bit more casual. Here you have the mess tent. These 55-gallon drums were used extensively for lots of different things. They cooked their food in them. They boiled their coffee in it. They used them for showers, rigged up with a pull chain. You just wanted to make sure that you got there before everybody else while the water was still cold. Here's a shot of the mess tent where when they're eating, and again with the 55-gallon drum. And inside, a little bit different atmosphere. Here's an officers club. This is a nice one too. This is at 7 Mile, and the enlisted men started to get clubs like this themselves. There eventually got to be a decent one at Port Moresby for the enlisted men. And when it was time for a mission, this is what it looked like. This is a 64th Bomb Squadron crew, part of the 43rd Bomb Group at Marba, about to take flight. And you can see this is how they dressed. They were bombing from not 20 or 25,000 feet. They were bombing from 5,000 to 8,000 feet. And once you got into skip bombing, you're talking about 200 to 250 feet over the water. There was no need for oxygen. They almost never wore oxygen. There was almost no need. Really about the only time was on certain recon missions and photo mapping missions, which had to be done at 20 to 25,000 feet. That was just about the only time they ever had to put oxygen masks on. And if this gentleman here looks maybe a little familiar to some of you, that is indeed Jay Zeamer,
flying his B-17 without a shirt, because sometimes that's just how it was done. And on a mission, if you looked out your window, you'd be happy to see this. There might be coordinated missions where you might have 7 or 8 planes from one squadron, 5 to 6 planes from another. They wouldn't all go at the same time. They'd be timed so that one would go through, and then another would come through on a particular target. But through 42, if you could get 5 or 6 planes over the target, you called that a mass effort. It was not unusual at all for 1 or 2 planes to turn around because of maintenance issues. Sometimes they turn around for storms, get lost in a storm, plow into the side of one of the Owen Stanley Mountains because of a storm. Wasn't unusual at all. The environment in the Southwest Pacific was as deadly as the Japanese. And this was a pretty typical scene. This is B-17. I love this shot. This is the B-17 Aztec's curse over Gizu Island, Gaizu. I love this. I love this shot. I use it as a background photo on my computer sometimes. But this is a very representative shot of the air war in the Southwest Pacific Theater in 1942 and certainly early 1943. It was low altitude and personal. If you want a good idea of what the difference between Europe and the Southwest Pacific is, you don't have to look any farther than this picture. Which takes us back to that map, and now you can understand why it became so important for them to be able to be based here in Australia and to be able to mount their missions through Port Moresby. And these missions would end up being anywhere from 8 to 12 hours long. The guys could spend a total of 12 to 18 hours in the air between leaving Australia, sleeping into the aircraft in Port Moresby until it was time to load the bombs and fuel into the aircraft. At night, by lamplight, the bombs and fuel were stored in the tall kunai grass there to protect it from the Japanese during the day. Then they would take off at maybe 4:30 in the morning to, say, drop some bombs across the runway at Lae or Buna over here on the east coast of Port Moresby, or go up and try to bomb some shipping in Rabaul Harbor at night, or maybe hit one of the airfields there. There were a few there at Rabaul. It was the most fortified harbor in the Pacific. But this was the Southwest Pacific Theater, and I think you can see what they had to overcome to achieve what they did. They only stopped the Japanese from capturing Port Moresby after taking Guadalcanal and defeating the Japanese at Milne Bay. Of course, the Navy had stopped them from taking it by sea back in May in the Battle of the Coral Sea. But it wasn't until Japan's defeat at Milne Bay that they were finally stopped for good. And in fact, as a side note, Willie Vaughn, the radio operator for the Eager Beavers, was still part of the 19th group when the Japanese attacked Milne Bay. And in fact, the 19th group, these airmen, were involved in the ground war there for a brief period of time. And in fact, Vaughn got a slice in the neck from a Japanese bayonet in the process. But he did manage to use his knife to kill the man who did it. But that's how close the combat got for some of the 19th Bomb Group veterans who were stationed there. But again, in August 42, the Marines did land on Guadalcanal and eventually took that from Japan. General George Kenney arrived in Australia in August of 42, restructured his command, revamped everything, started pulling all these disparate squadrons back together. He wasn't even aware that the 43rd Bomb Group was there. That's how bad the bureaucracy was at the time. But once he found out, he started gathering them all back here at Torren Creek and getting them to be a fighting unit. He put his right-hand man, Bill Ben, in charge of the 63rd Bomb Squadron of the 43rd to start developing skip bombing, which proved to be a highly effective method for attacking Japanese shipping, because the high-altitude bombing of shipping proved very ineffective. They had about a 1% hit rate because ships turn. So by the end of 42, especially in early 43, the Allies have finally established enough air supremacy in Papua New Guinea to be able to start developing Port Moresby, and the raids steadily stopped. Over that summer, the 43rd was transitioning into B-24s at that point, but the tide of the war is clearly turning to the Allies' advantage at that point. Hopefully, through this, you've been able to see just how much a difference there was between the Southwest Pacific and the European theater.
So there you have it. I think you can see why I want so much for the story of the Eager Beavers and the broader story of the 5th Air Force in general to get told, because it is a story of that part of the war that most people simply don't know about, and I think they should, because what the air crews and ground crews and construction crews managed to pull off, and even command in turning that war around in late 42 and going into 43, is simply incredible. And the fact is, they helped save Australia and turn the tide of the war in the Pacific against the most incredible obstacles and odds. And I believe they deserve recognition for that, just as much recognition as the bomb groups in Europe. And again, that's not to take anything away from what was experienced in Europe. I just think there needs to be some more proportion to the two, which is why I'm pushing so hard to get the story of the Eager Beavers and the 5th Air Force told. To that end, if you do want to learn more about the crew, you can visit my website, zemerseagerbeavers.com. There's a link to it in the description of this video. While you're there, if you also believe, as I do, that their story should be either a miniseries or a movie, there is a poll on my homepage. And if you scroll down, you can lend your vote and voice to that, so that I can let producers know that, hey, it's not just me. Thanks for watching. I'm Clint Hayes with ZemerSeagerBeavers.com.